Am I there? Have I managed to do that right, Callum?
Perfect.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. It's absolutely great to see you all. I'm Marian Pallister. I'm chair of Pax Christi Scotland, and I'm so pleased to be able to welcome our guest speakers and all of you to this conversation on human trafficking. And during that, we'll be asking the question, what price human dignity? In his Theology of Liberation, Gustavo Gutierrez reminds us that in Proverbs 14, we're told that to exploit the humble and poor worker and to delay the payment of wages is to offend God. Exploitation is a word we may hear frequently and in different contexts this evening. The focal point of Catholic social teaching is the human person made in the image of God. And so having fundamental freedom and dignity, the basis for human rights, we recognize this image in our neighbor, and the teaching rejects any policy or system that reduces people to economic units or passive dependence. So with this in mind, I would like to ask Pax Christi Scotland's chaplain, Father John Convery, to bring us together in reflection and prayer. Thank you, Father John.
Thank you, Marian, and a good evening and a big welcome to everybody joining their meeting this evening. And welcome to everybody. In the course of thinking about this evening's meeting, I've been reflecting a little bit about my own experience of ministry and pastoral work. I was ordained in 1991 here in Scotland, and I since then have been involved in ministry both here in Scotland and many and other parts of the world, including Africa and the USA. I recall different aspects of my ministry, and most recently, one of the ministries that I was humbly able to partake in was prison ministry. And each day that I visited the prison, I was acutely aware that after my day of ministry in the prison, I left it and the door was closed behind me and I went home. I remember even in my days of ministry in West Africa, in Cameroon, that I flew home. And in many aspects of my ministry, I had to reflect upon the true meaning of you might hear it this evening, the word solidarity. That many times I had the comfort and the privilege of being able to walk away, to leave that place to my own. I'm acutely aware this evening as I reflect upon my own solidarity with an issue such as human trafficking and many other aspects of poverty and injustice in the world, that many times, whether I choose to or not, I can walk away. I can close the door behind me and I can open the door of my living room and rest and recreate. Unfortunately, for many millions, estimated almost 30 million of people in this world of ours, they are unable to walk away, unable to have the choice of opening a door and walking out because they are imprisoned in whatever injustice they may find themselves in. And even during this time of global pandemic and lockdown, we reflect upon our own small experience of being somehow out of control, imprisoned in a certain way, but we also have the privilege and the luxury of opening the door and walking away. So I'd like to invite you, before we begin to share our solidarity, to reflect upon our own experience of working for justice with others and asking God to give us the strength to be in solidarity, not to pretend that we are but that we are merely called to be in solidarity and to speak for those who have no voice. So let's spend this moment in silence and gather our thoughts in what may have been a busy day for many of us, and to create a moment of peace and quiet to ask God to give us serenity and a clarity around this issue. O God of justice, God of compassion, and God of freedom and truth, we believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation might know abundant life. This evening, we raise our voices in anguished prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys, who are modern day slaves. They are your beloved daughters and sons, exploited sexually or forced to work because of human violence and greed. Fill us with your holy anger and your sacred passion for those who are trafficked, that those who are trafficked might know healing and justice, that traffickers will come to repentance and conversion, that all of us might live in such a way that others are not made to pay the price for our comfort and our convenience. Hasten the coming of the day when all people and our precious earth itself will be treated not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your freedom and justice, beauty and truth. May it be so. Amen.
Thank you so much, Father John, for that scene-setting reflection. Could I now introduce Emily Kenway, a writer and activist. Emily's a former policy advisor to the NGO Focus on Labour Exploitation, an organisation that goes by the acronym FLEX, and to the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. Prior to that, Emily spent several years working on a range of social justice campaigns. She is on the board of the Public Interest Research Centre and Commonwealth think tank, and is currently impact editor at Beyond Slavery, whilst also working on her second book. Her first, of course, is entitled The Truth About Modern Slavery, and I would recommend it as further reading after this evening's conversation if you haven't read it already. Emily, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marian, and everyone for being here. Before I just get started on my very brief bit about modern slavery, I wanted to say it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm speaking to quite a lot of groups and organisations about this topic and the book, but my great aunt was a Catholic nun and was quite influential on me, and an indomitable woman, very values driven, and one of those people that remains in my mind as a kind of archetype of what one would hope to be and to create kind of social justice in the world. So it's just lovely to be here. So obviously I don't have very long, so I'm really going to give kind of headline points rather than backing up everything I'm saying with evidence and analysis. Of course, as Marian's helpfully said, I have written a book, so it is all in there. So when I decided to write the book, it was because I'd spent quite a while working on this topic in different guises, and felt very frustrated with what was happening with regard to addressing severe exploitation. And I'm going to explain why, and therefore what we need to be doing to truly address it. So when we think about modern slavery, this is a phrase that's become popular over the last kind of couple of decades. And we need to understand that it's a particular way of speaking about severely exploitative circumstances. The kinds of circumstances that come into that can be not so severe looking. So it could be someone who has been recruited in an Eastern European country, told that they're going to be paid £300 a week, brought to the UK to work in a hand car wash, and they're actually being paid £100 a week. And that can be a case of trafficking, because you have the three constituent parts that you need for that to be the case. So it's important to understand that cases of modern slavery may not always look so extreme, and that has actually created problems in law courts where judges are misruling because they've got this idea of very extreme things in their mind. When we talk, therefore, about exploitation as modern slavery, what we're really doing, as I demonstrate in the book, is telling a particular story about exploitation. And this is a story that's been constructed through the 90s and 2000s. And what I show through various kinds of analysis that this story does is tells us that exploitation is anomalous. It's an aberration, right? It's something that's caused by deviant individuals on innocent victims who are lured into harm's way. That's the kind of storyline we get, and we want to liberate them and rescue them into freedom. So that's the classic modern slavery story. And you find it in the language. So you'll hear in speeches, some of which I used to write, and in any kinds of texts on this, that it's described as a parasite, a virus. We need to scrub supply chains clean. We need to inoculate people against it. These are all verbatim quotes. And if you notice, all of that language is about showing that it's something that shouldn't be there, that it's this kind of aberration, this stain on the otherwise acceptable socioeconomic fabric. You also hear very regularly in speeches of people kind of talking about exploitation in this way, that it's a humanitarian issue, it's a criminal issue, and that it's above party politics. When it became popularised in the UK, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, this was a really popular way of talking about it. It's above party politics, we can all come together behind it. Now, what is party politics? Party politics is obviously a disagreement about power distribution and resource distribution. Should the minimum wage be set at a rate you can live off, or a rate that businesses can still profit from? Should it be legal to move countries if you're rich, but illegal if you're poor, and so on? That is what party politics is. And of course, the story also, this phrase, modern slavery, is asking you to have connotations of historical slavery in your mind when you think of exploitation today. So it's a choice about talking about exploitation in that way to make you sit up, to make tabloids run stories, to make us be having this conversation. And in some ways it's worked really well because it's a powerful campaign kind of slogan, but it's also really problematic. And it's also incredibly different to historical slavery. We abolished historical slavery in 1833, right? But what we actually did in 1833 was abolish the legal right to own someone else. We made a legal change. We did not abolish the kinds of exploitation we're today calling modern slavery. We have never abolished that. And in fact, as I explain in the book, abolition of slavery in the early 19th century directly led to the things we are now calling modern slavery today, as plantation owners essentially freaked out that they'd lost loads of free workers and started a trafficking trade of millions of Indian and Chinese people. This idea that modern slavery is a kind of parasite that is not part of everything else and that we can just eradicate and vanquish is why awareness raising is a really popular tactic for tackling it. Because obviously, if it's something you think you can just spot and extricate, it makes total sense as a way of tackling it. It's also why rescue is the kind of favoured descriptive outcome. So we talk about, you're hard pressed to not find an anti-slavery charity using that term, or even you get buttons on websites saying fund freedom, fund rescue, this kind of thing. But what I show in the book is that it's a story, it's actually a fairy tale. And it might be uncomfortable and we might wish that it wasn't, but it's a fairy tale about exploitation, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, rescue is not rescue today. For many people, it's simply being regurgitated into another form of exploitation. That's because we have a global and certainly national economy that is built on increasingly precarious work, especially for obviously undocumented migrants. Sometimes people are deported back to their home country and the exploitation starts again from there. Secondly, it's a fairy tale because these things are not aberrations. They are produced by the economic system that we live in and the migration policy that we have in place. And it's really important here to understand that essentially the way we are arranging things is producing this harm. So for victims, they're often described as being lured in the press. That word comes up a lot. I love etymology, and I've looked into the etymology of that, and it's in the 15th century it was a collective noun for a group of young women, because the point of that word is about persuasion and seduction. And what this does in our minds when we read press about that or campaign materials is portrays people as kind of ignorant, as being duped, right? You were lured into this thing that sounded too good to be true. What on earth? We just need to educate them so that they know the risks of trafficking. That's what we're doing in the UK today. In homeless shelters, we've got posters up helping homeless people understand the risks that they might be trafficked. Well, actually, when you listen to people's testimonies and look at the burgeoning area of academic research on this specific bit about whether, about like luring, what you find is perfectly intelligent people who are not as fortunate as many of us here this evening, and who are making the best choice available to them because they have a lack of options, very kindred to what Father John was talking about. They can't walk away, and there's one door open, and it might be not the best door, but they're going to have to walk through it. I often think of the story of Mark, who was a British man who was trafficked in the UK and in forced labour for many years. And he told his story to the BBC, and he said, once I realised the situation I was in, and like it had all been deceptive and I was essentially in a really frightening, horrible situation, I had to make a decision. Was I going to stay, or was I going to try and escape? And he says, quoting him, he chose the lesser of two evils, which was to stay in exploitation, because for him, it was some food or no food. It was some shelter or no shelter. And that's where we have to get really real about what's happening in our society. And there's lots more research from all sorts of sectors around the world where this idea that people don't know the risk that they might be exploited is incorrect. Obviously, there's always some people who, there's exceptions to everything, but the majority know what's happening and they don't have a better option. And additionally, so for people who become victims, we're not giving them enough options for them to choose something better. They're just like us, they haven't got better options. But we also need to think about this from the perspective of perpetrators. So from the limited research that exists on traffickers, and thankfully it seems like there's kind of more and more impulse to do it, but there's very limited stuff, but it kind of shows they're generalist criminals rather than specialists. So specialists might be someone who does like forgery of certain kinds of things, or indeed rapists. But a lot of traffickers, they're generalist criminals. So they're trying to make money. They're looking for a way to make money. And what we've done for them is open the door wide to them by having groups of people in our society who are deprived of rights. So obviously undocumented migrants, sex workers in jurisdictions which have forms of criminalization, precarious workers who have no financial resilience and are going to say yes to something that's £7 an hour instead of £6, but actually turns out not to be that. and a lack of social safety nets, you know, all of those kinds of things creates a pool of people who lack those options, and it's wide open door for someone who wants to exploit people. And that combines with a lack of protective and justice mechanisms. So in the UK, we've radically underfunded labour inspectorates. The Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate does what it sounds like. Agency workers are very high risk for exploitation. It covers about 18,000 employment agencies, 1.1 million workers. How many staff do you think it has? It has 13, 1-3. And I have like a lot of stats like that on labour inspection, where it's just like, well, obviously we're going to be rife with this problem. And, you know, decline of trade unions is kind of the other side of that coin in a way, and police linking to immigration enforcement again. There's horrible evidence that unscrupulous employers are purposefully recruiting undocumented people because they can force them into terrible conditions, that they use the threat of denunciation to the immigration authorities to coerce them, and that both documented and undocumented migrants are very afraid of seeking help just in case immigration policy comes down hard on them. So that's like a obviously massively whistle-stop tour. And the last thing I'll say is that my book, as I say, and kind of my work around this is focused on saying, you know, fairy tales are really comforting. We all love fairy tales, but we actually need to make real change. So can we have the guts to put down the fairy tale? And I think What Price Human Dignity is a wonderful question and title. And for me, we need to recognize that dignity is born of rights and options. So a robust theory of change is based on that. It's about questions of power and distribution of resources so that people have different rights and options. And that is a real causal solution to this problem.
Well, what a start. Thank you so much, Emily. And I just feel that our acquiescence in that fairy tale that you explained there, that allows human trafficking and modern slavery once again takes us back to a sort of biblical stance that puts us firmly in the dock from our point of view. So perhaps it's appropriate to introduce DCI Stephen Healey from Police Scotland's National Human Trafficking Unit. Stephen, what is the situation like here in Scotland? Can you tell us that?
Yeah, so in terms of what Emily's just said, a lot is kind of ringing true here in Scotland. Most of our kind of exploitation you're seeing just now is sexual exploitation, labour exploitation. We've got a labour exploitation campaign running just now, which I'll touch on later on. As the criminal gangs are out there to exploit, to make money, and that's the long and short of it. There's threats, extortion, as Emily mentioned there, to the authorities, to the police, so they're frightened to come forward. And there's also a sense of, with some victims, particularly in sexual exploitation, that is their lot in life, and there's an acceptance, and it kind of rings true what Emily's saying as well. They're making a judgment. When you look at some of the Eastern European females that we come across who have been sexually exploited, their social and economic circumstances back in their country of origin are really, really very limited. They have, you know, they're not educated. A lot of them can't read or write. And, you know, I'm just going to be brutal here. What they have got is they're physically and sexually attractive, and they're using that to make money. And what they're doing with that money is they're giving some of that money to the crime group, but they're also making enough money to send home. So when we take executive action on crime groups that are exploiting females like that, it really is hard to get them on board, because what can we give them? We can't give them anything. We can put safety plans, we can put safety measures in place for them, we can look after their welfare and support, but they're not going to make the money that they think they should be making. And it's just, it seems to me, it's just an acceptance in their life that that's what they've got, and they've made that choice to go with that because they've got nothing else back home. And it is a sad indictment in today's day and age in our modern society that is the case. And I'm talking about European countries here, not talking about third world countries. It's European countries we're talking about. But anyway, I kind of digress. I've actually got a presentation to do tonight, Marianne, if that's okay. And I've decided that I thought long and hard about what to do, and I decided to present a case study of a human trafficking case that was involved in a few years ago. And for me, I hope that that'll highlight to the group here how crime groups operate, how they exploit people for financial gain, and I hope you'll find it interesting and helpful. So if that's okay, I'll just push on with that just now. Is that all right? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay. So I can't see anybody. Callum, could you come in? The
Yep.
screen I've got just now, is the screen come up okay? Yeah?
Not got anything yet, no.
Okay, give me a second then. Share screen. Just a sec.
That's it,
Okay,
coming
I
up
think
now.
that's
That's
us.
us, yep.
Okay, that was good to go, yeah?
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Callum. Okay, folks, so as I say, thanks, Marian, for that introduction there. And what I'm going to do is, as I say, present a case study that was involved in a couple of years ago that will illustrate the vulnerabilities around individuals, how they're exploited and how crime groups work. And I hope you find it interesting and helpful. And as I say, it'll give you a kind of tangible understanding of what actually happens and goes on. So this is Operation Heathyard, and how that started was back in 2016 when I worked at Livingston in West Lothian as a DCI there. And 2 Latvian males come into the police station to report concerns that members of their community were being exploited by a Latvian crime group. It came to light that there was a distribution warehouse for a well-known supermarket chain locally. I was mentioned where the victims were working, or some of them, and one of the suspects of the crime group worked here as a supervisor. Several other victims were identified who were resident in houses under control of these suspects as well within the West Lothian area. So when that was actually, when we were told about that, it was something unusual. I still remember to this day reading the overnight notes, the crime notes overnight. I had responsibility for all serious crime within West Lothian and other areas at that time. That was really unusual. So I sent 2 of my detectives out, and they come back following their update. We set up an inquiry team. What happened was we identified that 4 Latvian males within their local community were involved in a sophisticated fraud and were laundering money through that fraud. In order to do so, they required to recruit individuals already in Scotland or out with Scotland to come to the west of Scotland in West Lothian so that they could have them open bank accounts. And we're talking that all these individuals were Latvians. So it was either Latvians from Latvia or from the UK or other parts of Scotland that they recruited to come to West Lothian. One of the members, as I said, was a supervisor within a supermarket distribution centre and was able to assist with recruitment there. So what that did was that gave them a real bit of credibility because they knew this individual, they knew he worked in as a supervisor within a distribution centre, and it gave them credibility that he would be able to tend to migrate to that type of work. And I think they're well regarded as hard workers in the distribution industry. So we also found out that other existing victims at the time were encouraged to try and recruit others to come to Scotland, and that was in return for the offer of discounted rent and discounted debt that they actually owed the crime group. And I'll go into how that worked just shortly. But our investigative priority for this is follow the money. It's absolutely critical and crucial to follow the money, because you follow the money, you find the people who are committing crimes, and then you can take executive action. So that was our investigative priority at the outset. Really, what was this sophisticated fraud then? Well, basically, the motive was financial and labour exploitation, and the fraud was quite simple, but a bit sophisticated in terms of an ICT perspective. What you had was a hacker who would infiltrate and install malware virus on emails. Those emails were then sent out to multiple small businesses and individual persons throughout the country. And when they opened up their emails, the malware would then attack their computers, and it would then allow the crime group momentary access to their bank accounts, their business bank accounts, and their personal bank accounts. And what they were able to do from there was withdraw money electronically from one bank account, but inevitably it had to go to another bank account. You can always follow the digital trail or the electronic trail of money. So to do that, they needed other bank accounts for this money to go in, what we would call mule bank accounts. And for that purpose, what they did then was recruited individuals to come to West Lothian and offer a job, and then then force them to open up bank accounts. What I called that is, when we eventually got through a couple of months of investigation, we found out how this was working. I called it the perpetual cycle, and you'll be able to see what I mean in a minute. I think this is probably the easiest way to explain how the crime group operated and how the victims were discarded at the end of this. So, as I say, called it the perpetual cycle. The victims were recruited for the purpose I've just mentioned. They needed people to open up bank accounts. They were promised employment in West Lothian area in the distribution warehouse, because one of the members of the crime group was a supervisor there, and that was really credible option for them, and they were going to make a lot more money there than they would have back home in Latvia, where the employment opportunities were really limited. So as soon as they come into the UK, whether that be they flew into Edinburgh, they got a bus to Edinburgh or flew into Liverpool, right away there's control of movement. The crime group actually met them at the airport and brought them up here, or they would pay for a bus ticket for them to come up here. We'd meet them at Edinburgh bus station, and then they would take control of that individual and take them to a house in West Lothian where they would put them. So they placed them into poor, overcrowded housing. And what I mean by that is they would rent a 3-bedroom semi and put 10, 12 people in that, and they would rent that for £600 a month, but they would charge our victims £175 a fortnight for board and lodgings. So you multiply that by 10, that's what, £1,750 a fortnight. You're talking about £3,500, £4 grand a month, and they're paying £500-600 for that. But there's no doubt in my mind that unscrupulous landlords knew exactly what was going on and were quite happy to take a cut of that. But that was one way that they exploited them. So the next thing that they did was, so the promise of a job never materialised. So for 2 to 4 weeks, then they didn't have a job, but they then owed the crime group money. So they had either owed them £175 or £300, and they'd no way of paying that. So the way that the crime group forced them then to open up bank accounts, forced them up to open bank accounts. They would then take them into various banks within the West Lothian area, 5 or 6 different banks, and then force them to open up these bank accounts. And of course, if they didn't do that, there was threats, intimidation and violence. And it wasn't until actually after we realised what was going on, we looked back at various incidents involving Latvians, we started making the connection. But at that time, they weren't forthcoming to say that they were being exploited and were being assaulted because of this. And again, that's because of fear of retribution. But again, so going back to the actual fraud itself, they've made a lot of money stealing from bank accounts through this malware virus. They have to put it somewhere. They were putting it in here into these bank accounts. They were forcing them then to go to the banks to withdraw the cash physically. So that the electronic trail then ended banks. It was all under kind of the level of about £500-600. They would take it out physically and then hand it to the crime group. Or the crime group, because they had control of the houses that they stayed in, would take their bank cards and PIN numbers and withdraw the cash themselves. They were also encouraged to recruit others, as we said as well. And again, one of the reasons for that was that they would then waive the debt that they owed to them. And at the end of it all, they were discarded, because what would happen is the banks would blacklist them, because they then came to realise that there was suspicious activity in 5 or 6 accounts, with all this money going in but taken out very quickly. So they would blacklist the individuals concerned, our victims. Our victims then had no means of real employment because they needed a bank account to be employed. That then made them more susceptible, once again, just what Emily spoke about there, more susceptible to exploiting and trafficking, because they didn't have any means to get paid. Some of the victims did actually get jobs, but the crime group as well, they told the distribution centre warehouse that they don't have bank accounts, just pay their wages in to my bank account, and I'll give them money, their wages, what they're due. And that never actually happened. They always got a fraction of that. So, and again, you know, the victims were discarded, but the actual fraud still went on. So we needed more victims again, because the money's still coming in. You need more people to open up bank accounts. They will eventually get shut down and discarded because of suspicious activity in the bank accounts. So that's why we called it the perpetual cycle. That was their criminal operating model for that fraud and for that exploitation. So kind of moving on then, this is a crime group here, and I'm not giving you any personal information or confidential information here. This is all open source. These individuals have been convicted, and you can, if you look up online, you'll find this yourselves. The male at the top here, Hardis Langstein, he was based in Manchester. He was running the group. These two individuals here, Marius Kursch and Avers Zazerjans, were the enforcers. This individual here, Avers Zazerjans, he was 6'6" and an ex-basketball player, a really imposing character. And when you look at the victims, they were all kind of young, late teens, early 20s. Some had drug and alcohol issues, so they're quite vulnerable and impressionable. And this crime group gave the impression that they were a Latvian mafia. They were actually far from that, but to a younger kind of group of people, exert a lot of control and fear over them. And of course, this is Arvid Zivkos, who actually worked in the distribution centre, who was able to get jobs for some of our victims. And again, this is quite an interesting just slide here. This is Hardis Langstein down in Manchester. What they would actually do, the crime group, was they would take him physically, all the money that they took from the bank accounts, they would take down to him. They all got a cut of it, and some of it went up the tree as well. But just round about here, I'm not sure if you can see it, he's actually shuffling about 10 or 12 bank cards here, and he's walking up to an ATM. If you look at this individual here, he's actually looking at them, seeing all these bank cards. And when you actually play the CCTV, you see him get in, putting the bank cards in, withdrawing money, then the next bank card, then the next bank card. So that was all very good evidence for us. So the investigation itself, it was a 7-month inquiry. It took a long time, involved a lot of witness engagement, CCTV inquiries, telecoms, social media, real significant financial inquiries, covert inquiries, and that culminated in a day of action late December 2016, involving 100 officers in West Lothian and in Manchester. All 4 were arrested and charged with various offences, and they get released on bail. We get strong bail conditions to keep them out of the West Lothian area to try and disrupt them as best we could, which we were able to do. And then after a 3-month trial at Edinburgh Sheriff Court back in December 2018, almost 2 years later, they were all convicted of being involved in serious and organised crime. That's just the legislation there. Despite the fact they were charged with various things, that's what they get convicted of. And that wasn't really a bad thing, because they got the highest possible sentence you can get at a sheriff court, which was 4 years, 11 months. I think the sheriff and the jury knew exactly what was going on there. And I've got to take my hat off to COPFS, or Crown Prosecution Service, if you like. They did a really good job prosecuting that real challenging case, difficult case and complicated case. But to get that was really, you know, it was a great day for us, because you're sending out a strong, clear message that, you know, perpetrators of this horrible crime, of human trafficking, of exploitation, you know, if you commit these crimes, then you're going to get serious time in the jail. And that was really beneficial for us. It wasn't without its challenges, to be perfectly honest with you. This, a lot of victims we identified provided statements to the police at the time. Some returned to Latvia, others remained within the UK, in other pockets of the Latvian communities. I think in Hampshire, they're there, in other parts of the UK as well. And some, as I say, went back. Some of the victims were vulnerable in terms of alcohol and drug dependency, and were scared to give evidence. It was a real challenge 2 years down the line to try and keep them on board, to try and keep their cooperation throughout here and Latvia. I mean, we were over in Holland speaking to Europol, we were in Latvia speaking to Latvian police to help us, we were in Denmark as well, trying to get their help too. So we were all over the place trying to pull all this together. So it was a real challenging inquiry. And also during the evidence, there was a reluctance from the male victims to say out loud that they were scared or had been threatened. But, you know, we got there in the end with it. But the learning outcomes for that and the prevention for that as well was quite positive. We influenced the way that this distribution centre paid migrant workers. So following this, they came to us. They were an ethical employer, and they were really aghast that this was happening. But it's just like what Emily was saying, when you're going to agency workers, they don't seem to have the same rights. it's all about ethical recruitment now. And I think companies are coming to realise it a bit more than they did back in 2007 when this came to court. So they now, they've changed their policy in ensuring that all migrant workers have their own bank accounts. But funnily enough, I was talking to Sean Stirling from the Modern Slavery down in London, and he was saying they've come across a few occasions now where they've got these migrant workers who've got their own bank accounts, but what you've got is a crime group actually taking them to the bank, taking them to the ATM and taking about 50% of their wages. So there's always ways and means of overcoming, positive influences that employers try and put in place to stop this. But what the crime groups are doing now is actually taking people who are being exploited to the bank and taking their money off them through fear of retribution as well. We've done a lot of safer communities work as well. We printed off leaflets highlighting exploitation in various Eastern European languages for workers and signposting them to the police and support agencies, and also to some of the managers within these places as well. The partnership approach was absolutely crucial. You couldn't take an inquiry on like this without the partnership approach. I mean, we had the local authority, we need a reception centre, you need health and well-being, which is really, really important for the victims. It's not just about, locking bad people up. You've really got to look after the victims, ensure their health and well-being is catered for, help with repatriation, help with where are they actually going to stay when this has happened, who's going to look after them, how they're going to get money, that type of thing. Accommodation, as I say, financial help, and also, without the NCA and Crown Office, we would never get this over the line. And finally, just for me, when you've got a job for human trafficking, it all boils down to money. Everything boils down to money. Money's the root of evil, without a doubt. So follow the money. If you follow the money, you'll find out who's involved in it. And what you can actually do then is you can look at it, just gives you a different route to go in. If you can look at the different ways that you can disrupt and attack crime groups who are carrying out these types of crime from a side of it, there's all different things that you can actually do. So, but follow the money is absolutely crucial to establishing who's responsible for trafficking. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. I've probably on a wee bit over my time here. Police Scotland just now are actually running a labour exploitation campaign. You might have seen the ads. Some of the ads are on TV just now. It's about break the chain of labour exploitation. We've got a microsite set up for it just now called endlabourexploitation.co.uk. I would encourage you to go to that microsite to look at it. It gives you a lot of good information around about labour exploitation from a public and from a company point of view, how to look out for it, what to do and how to report it. And it's something our comms team done a really good job. Myself and Phil Capaldi, the detective superintendent, worked with them on it. But to be fair to them, they've really pulled it out the hat because it's an excellent campaign, and I would actively encourage you to take the opportunity to look at that when you've got a minute. And I'll stop there, ladies and gentlemen. I think there's going to be questions later on. And Marian, I'm sorry, I've probably over my time slightly there, so my apologies.
That's absolutely fine, Stevie, because what you've given us there, very complicated, very complex, very shocking, but it gives us one particular case there. Glad to hear about that care for victims part of what you said at the end, because I think that's so important. So we've got a website to look at. Perhaps you could put that website on the chat, and that would give people details. We've got a book to read, and Emily, I'm sure, could put that onto the chat. But right now we've got Dr. Paul Rigby, who is social work lecturer at Stirling University, and he's a leading authority on child trafficking and a member of the advisory group of the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Now, Paul, can you follow on to what we've heard so far and tell us what your research is all about, please? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barry, and thanks for the invite tonight. So yeah, my area of work is just child trafficking, but picking up on the information from both Emily and Stephen today. I mean, I would just reiterate the first issue is the complexities of the issues here. And I'm in a privileged position working in academia. I'm working across policy as well, that I can take a critical approach to it as well as supporting government and practitioner colleagues in terms of addressing some of the issues. But I think the points that Emily made specifically, interestingly, was the focus of the book that we published back in 2016 was around the complexities of exploitation. We had to look beyond the headline figures and the headline issues of what we were seeing happening across Scotland and internationally. But really the story in Scotland around child trafficking, well, the story begins years and years ago, hundreds of years ago, because I've traced it back to some of the 18th, 19th century writing where we could identify exploitation of children that were moved from the highlands to work in the factories, etc., or from the fields to work in the bigger fields. So it's not a new phenomenon in that respect, but in terms of what we're talking about today, probably around 15, 20 years, we've been aware of the issue in Scotland as something that we need to work with and we need to look at, and we need to put it in the context of what's happening internationally. So within that complexity, that the work that I'm involved with really started from a piece of work in Glasgow back in 2006 and 7, where we were working with separated and unaccompanied children who were arriving in Glasgow, and there were concerns around their exploitation on top of their day-to-day issues that they were facing as migrant children. And it was at that point that in Scotland we started to look at, basically we called it child trafficking, we call it child protection, probably more so in Scotland, and we focus on the protection of children rather than the issues that Emily picked up on, actually, in terms of migration and immigration and the reasons that people choose, or children choose, to come to Scotland. We certainly don't find that a lot of the children have been forced in any extent. And again, it's that choice and the agency of the children and young people that we're identifying. One of the challenges we have, though, with working with under 18-year-olds is that in line with UNCRC, with the human rights perspective, as, what's the right word to use, as the responsible adults, if that's the term, we have a duty under our legislation that we have to support and work with children as best as possible to minimise any further risk of exploitation. So we can't really allow them to choose to continue to be in exploitation. And that is a challenge in terms of children's agency. And the point that Emily made, which is particularly pertinent, often children come into Scotland and sending money back to countries of origin if we're talking about children from abroad. So over the years in Scotland, the work that we've looked at is focused on separated and unaccompanied children arriving across borders. But more recently, we're now starting to identify the exploitation of vulnerable young people in Scotland and the UK. And for those who recall, the incidents of child sexual exploitation in some of the larger urban conurbations across England, we're now starting to look at that in Scotland and some of the issues around the exploitation of children that may fit in this this label of trafficking, but it's not one that we try to use to an extent that it negates any other type of exploitation. So that's why in Scotland we approach this with a child protection hat on, if you like. And the work involves working with the children and young people to support them as best as we can in terms of meeting their needs on a day-to-day basis, and whether that's children from abroad or children from the UK. One of the challenges over the years is the issue of immigration and migration, and quite often trafficking is conflated with immigration and migration. And really, the Human Trafficking Acts in Scotland, and most of those across the globe that have been enacted over the last few years, are really focusing on exploitation, and trafficking is the term that's come to the fore. And I'm purposely not using modern slavery, because I don't like the term modern slavery because of the issues that Emily mentioned. I much prefer exploitation rather than trafficking in that respect. So in Scotland, following the work that I was involved with over the last 15 to 16 years, we've now got the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Act. And within Scotland, within the UK, that's recognised as a particularly strong act in terms of the support that it offers for children and young people. And that's where most of my work is focused on, is working with the main agencies in Scotland for supporting children would be local authority social work departments. And obviously Stephen's explained in terms of the police and the prosecution aspects of it, but also the role of the police along with social work is child protection. So across Scotland, police and local authorities work very closely together in identifying and working with children and young people. And generally, if they're from abroad, when they're identified, they're accommodated through in local authority accommodation, and the support is offered through social work and adjacent agencies. So in Scotland in 2010, the Scottish Guardianship Service was established, and that followed a lot of I hate to use the term lobbying given what we're seeing in the news at the moment, but in terms of the lobbying around Scottish Parliament and the development of the children's services, the Scottish Government now fund the Scottish Guardianship Service, which is collaboration between Aberlour and the Scottish Refugee Council, and they support separated children who are at risk of trafficking and children from abroad. So that's a really well-known, internationally recognised service, and Scotland is seen as probably one of the leaders in that respect. And we believe, and I would say this because I've been involved with it for a while, but one of the reasons the Scotland is seen as at the forefront of work with children is because of the child protection focus that we take, and we try to keep the immigration aspects to the side. Now, clearly, we can't ignore it completely because of some of the issues that Emily's mentioned. But we tend to focus in Scotland on the actual exploitation of the young people rather than how they managed to get here and what's happened and what we've identified. I'm not going to go into numbers, I've got the stats, but I think I would agree with Emily and Stephen on that. Sometimes it's the case studies that can highlight some of the issues, but also it's broader than individual cases, and there's no one case that's the same. All cases are different. And we have children from all over the world at the moment who have arrived in Scotland. The Scottish Guardianship Service have worked with around about 800 separated children over the last 10 years. And roughly 30–40% we were really concerned about exploitation. So that gives you an indication of the scale of the problem in Scotland in terms of the resources that are required to work with the young people. But in that respect, whether they're identified as trafficking victims or not, the support would be there in Scotland through the child protection legislation. So in terms of my work with the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and the groups that I sit on with the Scottish Government, my role is to sort of support that from a sort of academic evidence-based perspective, but also from that critical perspective as well, in terms of being an independent academic, that it's not about following party political lines in terms of how we work with children and young people. It's following the evidence where we can, following good practice. But for me personally, it is that critical perspective and what we can provide to the Independent Slavery Commissioner or to the Scottish Government in terms of critique of policy and how things are developing at the moment. So really, moving forward, the Scottish Government, with the human trafficking legislation, developed the human trafficking strategy, and that's a reasonably all-encompassing approach to work with the partners across Scotland to identify, where possible, victims of trafficking and to support them. And one of the key features of the Scottish perspective is supporting them in whatever they require, whether that's if it's from abroad to return home, or if not, to remain in Scotland and make a life in Scotland. And that's where that crossover that Emily talked about in terms of the exploitation. We do recognise that people have made choices very often, and then they've got caught up in exploitative situations. But we're very clear that those exploitative situations are one of the human trafficking strategy groups looks at this, and it looks at some of the background factors and circumstances that would support the traffickers in exploiting people. And I think, just to reiterate the points that Stephen and Emily have made already, it really is about money, and the traffickers, the ones that we've identified, and their modes of working is very much a business model. So they're in the business to make money, and it's about exploitation, and it's certainly not about evil people doing bad things, although clearly it's not good what they're doing. But the people that we've identified over the years, and I've just supervised a PhD student doing work in Nigeria, and he's gone back to Nigeria now and he's working over there. And one of the issues we're identifying is it's sometimes very difficult to make distinctions between those who are trafficking and those who have been trafficked. And it's all about that circle of exploitation and how people are making money and making more money through the exploitation of others that have followed them on. And that's where the complexity of the work just makes any simple answers or any simple response to this issue particularly problematic. And I think it's an age-old issue that's been around for many years. When children are involved, it can be particularly upsetting. And certainly we need to be careful when we're talking about what's happening in terms of divulging too much information about some of the difficult, complex circumstances that children find themselves in. But one of the challenges I've said already with working with children is making sure that we're listening to what they're telling us, but also the responsibility of as the adults, as the support workers, to offer them the support that they require to hopefully exit the situation, but generally it's supporting them in terms of where they are in their life at the moment. And unfortunately, as already been mentioned, quite often children may be returned through the immigration system to countries of origin where the exploitation then can commence again. So I think that the simple message from the work that I've been involved with over the years is to engage with the complexities of the exploitation and address it on an individual basis for children, for each child that we're working with, but also of recognition that's a little bit broader than that in terms of the economic circumstances and the exploitative situations that people find themselves in. But I think just to finish, from a Scottish perspective, we are very fortunate in Scotland in terms of the agencies working together and in terms of the government that have put a lot of resources behind addressing some of these issues and also looking at some of the broader exploitative situations that give rise to the trafficking and the exploitation of children and young people and adults. But I think the message is it's ongoing work, and it's not an easy one to, well, picking up on what Emily was saying in terms of eradication, whether that's ever possible in terms of the way that we've lived the last few thousand years of human existence. Exploitation is just a fundamental part of human existence, and that is one of the messages that's really difficult to hear. And that's why exploitation and trafficking is really difficult to address. I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That adds to the complexities that we've already heard, and I think that it would be a good time just now to remind everybody that we've got a couple of questions already in the chat box, but please put those questions there. We're running a little bit over time, but we do have time after Carmen has spoken to have the questions, and I'm sure that there are burning ones that have cropped up from our three speakers so far. But now I would like to introduce you to Carmen Artigas Moreno, who joins us from Uruguay. And I've got to thank the Scottish Laity Network for putting us together, because Carmen has been at a number of the Scottish Laity events over the past while, and that's brought us together. So she's an expert on mission on the United Nations Internal Justice Council. She's a lawyer who specialises in international law and the right to development. So we look forward to hearing that international perspective. Thank you very much, Carmen.
Can you hear me? Thank you. I am going to thank Marian very especially for trusting me to participate in this dialogue, being someone who is 11,000 kilometers from all of you and someone that has never been to Scotland. But my presentation will be basically on international frameworks and my advocacy for the need to face an international law to work together. And we are still a long way from that, and we are still a long way from coordination and consistency in both trends. So, Callum, thank you if you can pass it. Well, you know, Pope Francis has defined this clearly. Slavery, trafficking, exploitation are commodifications and a crime against humanity. Commodification in the sense that the human beings being exploited, being trafficked, are considered commodities, are considered like things. And in this way, they are deprived of all their rights and dignity. You know that there are pastoral orientations on human trafficking from the Vatican. And well, there are many of the things you have already mentioned, the dynamics of human trafficking as an ugly, evil business, the commodification, the exploitation, the demand aspect, the reluctance to acknowledge the dire reality of human trafficking, and this has many points in common, what has been said here. But there is also, because this PowerPoint has been kindly intervened by Marian to make it less UN and more friendly. There were another things there, but what I want to underline is economy. I mean, the economics in this world is really bringing the vulnerable, the poor, the excluded as clear victims of trafficking. The next one, please, Callum. Okay, this was my picture, but Marian put this there. People of faith have taken action. And I do not want to expand on this, but there are a lot of Christian organizations working on the issue of human trafficking. You know, Talita Kum, the organization from the religious congregations, you know, Renate, which are the religious, the European religious working on this. And you have a very interesting initiative, and probably Stephen know it, is the Santa Marta group in the Vatican, that is an initiative assembling police, assembling religious congregations, assembling social workers in order to work together towards the approach to this crime. The next one, Callum. Well, a glimpse into United Nations efforts. Marian wanted me to give you a glimpse. You have lots of things there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is obvious, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Then the International Human Rights Charter, who has many instruments, but I think that the most important one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I mean, the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, the right to work. And whenever these rights are violated, we bring people to poverty, we bring people to exclusion, and we make them victims of human trafficking. There you have also the United Nations Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking and the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking. Probably in future occasions, I hope we will have some, we can go deeper into this. The next one, Callum. I think that these are the most important instruments, but they are instruments in which we have to work further. The United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, no doubt, trafficking, exploitation, or whatever you wish to call it, is a crime. And there are two protocols to the convention, the one to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, and the protocol against the smuggling of migrants. And many of you have said that. We said, oh, well, look, migrants come to this place, but they are not trafficked. Yes, they are trafficked. Migrants are trafficked. They are even asked in Libya to give a kidney to be crossed to Italy. They are asked to prostitute the Libya if they are able to, and if they do not drown, and then go to Europe, and then they are trafficked. They are converted into prostitutes, into child begging in the streets. So we shouldn't be differentiating and calling, well, these are undocumented people and the other ones are trafficked people. No, they are all the same. They are all exposed to the same threats. And then there's something very important here. Of course, the professor knows more about this than me, but it's a protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child against the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Those are important instruments. Then we have a group, I'm sorry, I go quickly because I want to finish in my 10 minutes. You have a lot of experts from the Human Rights Council, the UN expert on trafficking in person, the UN expert in contemporary forms of slavery, the UN expert on the sale and sexual exploitation of children. Well, and then another group of instruments that go straight into development issues, into poverty. And so this is the answer of the United Nations to what Emily Masterly put forward. I mean, these are responsibilities of the governments, and what we have to do is to advocate for these instruments to be implemented in our countries. The next one, Callum, please. Well, we were asked about if we should share the blame. Yes, Pope Francis has been clear. If we do not do anything, we are accomplice to this crime, and he asked us to pray and fight to look for an economy of care based on the social teaching of the church, a culture of encounter, go towards the victims, integrated approaches and social emancipation. Some people do not like this word, but it is not only, I mean, freeing the people from the situation of slavery, of exploitation, but also give this person a role in the society. A dignified life with human rights, but also an opportunity to work for others. And what I would like to see, and I must confess, is the same kind of demonstrations and people involved in going to the before the parliaments, before the government, saying, well, we fight against climate change, we fight against nuclear weapons, but we are also demonstrating against trafficking in persons. It's such a terrible reality. We should demonstrate, we should involve youth, we should get young people demonstrating against this. I mean, climate change is horrible. I have worked on that in the past. The nuclear weapons, I have written something for Pax Christi England and Wales on nuclear weapons. But what about trafficking? We need to go out and demonstrate. And then education, of course, we have to educate the people who can do something, like our youngs, and also the people that are subject to this kind of crimes, and alert them through education. Well, Pope Francis speaks about the 4 Ps, prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership, and also the interfaith cooperation, which is very important, and we can speak about that on another occasion. The next one, Callum. I want to thank my friend Rod Burnett, because through him I read about this this phrase, which is from a poet, from somebody very, very important for you. And it is, our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. And in connection with human trafficking, we implement many things, many conventions, but we do not have imagination to work together. And this is another thing that impacted me in an article about whether, the existence of God could be proved with the recent astronomical discoveries. And it says that light thinks that it goes faster than anything, but when light arrives, darkness is already there. So it is like the sons of darkness and the sons of the light. Always human trafficking, criminal organizations, the mafia are always before us. So we have to be very creative in order to be before them. To finish, Abraham Lincoln, I love this phrase: if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. And finally, Pope Francis says that we have to struggle so that every slave person returns to being a free agent of his or her own life and to take an active part in the construction of the common good. Thank you. That's all on my part.
Gosh, thank you, Carmen. That what I promised to do is that I will send Carmen's presentation and her longer presentation out along with the recording link and so on when we get that tomorrow. So I want to thank all of the speakers, but now it's your turn, and I think that I'm going to hand over to Callum to say, you know, what are the things that people are wanting to know there, because it's so complex, and I'm sure that you've all got questions to ask. If you can either attract Callum's attention or simply to put your question in the chat box and he will put it to our speakers there. So thank you, Callum.
Thanks, Marian. And I can only see a small number of people on my screen. So if you can stick it in the chat, that makes life much, much easier for me. What I'm going to do is just bring our speakers onto screen for you. And what we'll do is we'll just put our questions to them as a panel. So our first question tonight comes from Hugh, and Hugh's question is directed to yourself, Stephen, and to yourself, Emily. He asks, how helpful have you guys found the trade unions in Scotland or the UK as a whole as a support in confronting these issues? So perhaps Stephen first and then over to Emily, if that's okay.
Yeah, so from a policing point of view, we've not had much engagement with the trade unions and the Scottish Government strategy in that human trafficking. I think it's Action Area 3. We've got a man called Shan Saba who works with Brightworks recruitment, and Shan's got the lead for kind of businesses and trying to highlight human trafficking through businesses and ethical recruitment and the like. So in terms of from us, it's more enforcement and some education round about that. But from a police perspective, for like my own experience is that the case study that I did, we did go to, through our Safer Communities, we did go to the local distribution warehouse. We went to the actual the supermarket chain as well and explained to them what we were doing. So it was more to do with the kind of management of the actual premises, and I think that's more or less been reflected throughout Scotland. We've not actually had to approach unions yet from a national perspective, but I'm pretty sure you would get full support from unions round about human trafficking. But it's something that probably Action Area 3 of the Scottish Government strategy on human trafficking would tend to lead on.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, I really like this question, because often what you find with this topic is that unions aren't considered as part of the toolbox of solutions we need, because of this idea of it being an aberration, when actually obviously a kind of organised workforce where people know their rights and there's clear pathways to protect those rights is going to be less porous to exploitation coming in. So that sort of one point is that unions are part of the solution, but if you talk to big businesses, they will be like, oh, we're doing audits instead, or we've got this modern slavery app, and they're trying to avoid anything that is about power, basically. In terms of the interest of unions, a couple of years ago, I worked with the TUC on an education module for reps on this topic. So, you know, there is some kind of knowledge and some kind of awareness, but obviously there's lots of things that they're busy with. And there are unions in England that are informing Labour Inspectorate strategies around this topic for sure. What I would say though is that they're massively hamstrung by immigration policy from being more helpful. Obviously the traditional unions haven't always been that great at organising migrant workers anyway. In the UK now we have two really amazing small new unions who are working with like migrant cleaners and stuff like that. But what do you do if you are kind of an ethical person and you identify someone in an exploitative circumstance under the political regime we're under? Do you refer them in, and therefore they may end up being criminalized for their immigration status and deported? Or do you, regurgitate them into more bad work? It's like, that's when I'm talking to unions at the moment. It's like, well, what are they meant to do? There isn't actually a very good option at the moment. So I think, again, what you'll find with this topic is like immigration policy is just going to keep coming up, and it annoys civil servants and politicians quite a lot, but unfortunately it's the reality.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Stephen. Paul, I wonder if you might pick up on that specific point then. We've got a question here. Would a more sympathetic immigration policy, which of course is a reserved issue in the UK at the moment, help that issue in any way?
I'm not sure there is a sympathetic immigration policy. I think that's the nature of immigration policies. It's one of the challenges, and everybody has picked up, the speakers have picked up on it, is trafficking it's not an immigration crime. Trafficking is a crime against the person. It's a crime of exploitation. And in the UK, in Scotland, we're now identifying a lot of victims of trafficking that UK citizens, so clearly it doesn't come into the equation at all. Unfortunately, over the years, the immigration and trafficking discourses have been conflated, and the legislation, while not conflated, is problematic. So I try not to get onto this topic to a great extent, because my firm belief is it's a completely separate issue. Trafficking needs to deal with exploitation. Immigration issues, or the immigration legislation system, needs to deal with immigration, but we can't ignore the link between the two. So the problem is, while the legislation needs to be separated out, we have to recognise what are some of the factors that cause exploitation, and that is people moving between countries. So that's where the complexities come into the issue, because it's not, trafficking is not an immigration crime, and it was never designed to be an immigration crime, and especially in the UK. But the links are so close and so complicated. That's why we have problems between the two aspects.
Callum, could I just add another point in response, if that's okay? Of course, agreed, like they're separate legally. I think the problem here, and possibly what the questioner maybe has in mind, is that our current immigration policy creates like a precondition for exploitation, sure, not of British victims. So for example, visas like the overseas domestic worker visa that makes it difficult to change employers, or in Scotland, very interesting report from Flex, where I used to work, on the new short-term visa for farm workers that's finding really awful risks around debt bondage and trafficking and stuff like that. And that's because of the visa design, restricting people. They've got no recourse to public funds. It's hard for them to change employer. They're very dependent on their employers and so on. The illegal working offence being a direct tool used by traffickers to coerce migrant workers. So yeah, like I get what you're saying, Paul, with the kind of legal aspect, and then, but it more, repealing the hostile environment would definitely reduce exploitation of migrants in the UK. And I think, we can just all agree on that, really, I think.
Thank you. Carmen, I wonder if perhaps you want to comment briefly on that one as well, but also perhaps to ask Sarah's, to answer Sarah's question, which is, how can church networks help victims of trafficking?
Okay, you know that I have inserted a suggestion that this the subject of trafficking, exploitation, should be part of the parishes and organizations' reflections. Proposals for actions. I am really amazed from my tiny corner in the South Atlantic on how the churches in Scotland and in the UK in general are so active and so committed. This is not the case in my church. And And I say, well, you're so committed with the migrants, you're so committed, with against many subjects like climate change. So why do not have groups in the parishes to understand better this problem? And you go to work with people that are many times victims of, or possible victims of human trafficking. Talk with migrants that you work with, understand better which their situation is. I think that this is part of the things that the Vatican is asking us in the guidelines for pastoral work on against trafficking. So you could read them, see how you can move into this, and how to can link the social teachings of the church with the construction of a future of dignity for these people. That's what I would do. I cannot do that in my church because my church is not interested in these things, unfortunately. That's why I participate so much in your activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think just on a personal note, I've been really struck from the work of of Stella Maris and the Apostle, formerly known as the Apostleship.
I didn't mention that. I am a member of the Apostleship, but I didn't mention that because I didn't want to get too lengthy. But yes, with the fishermen, and fishermen are in terrible situations. Yes, the Apostleship of the Sea is doing a lot, and you can also interact from your parish with the Apostleship. Yeah. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, Carmen. Stephen, perhaps a couple of more practical points then. Two questions, if I might. First one, are victims who are identified likely to be removed from the country? And is there a network of police action on the issue? Do you involve police from the countries where trafficked people come from, for example?
Yeah, so answer to the first question, are people or victims likely to be removed from the country? So that the Home Office have got a recording mechanism called the National Referral Mechanism for Victims of Human Trafficking. And that is recorded, and it's for the Home Office then to decide when the details of how they got here, the elements of the trafficking, how all that came about is recorded in the forum. That's recorded as a crime that will go to the relevant police force for inquiry. They'll then update that National Referral Mechanism forum, and the Home Office will then make a judgment whether that individual's got the grounds, or whether or not they are a victim of human trafficking. They've got reasonable grounds or conclusive grounds to stay in the country. So that it all depends on what we call a single competent authority, which is a Home Office organisation who make that decision. In terms of do we work with other police agencies internationally? Yes, we do. Prior to Brexit, we had what was called JITs, joint investigations with other European countries, and we've had several of them. The case study that I did with a JIT with the Latvian police, and that was really helpful because what you've got is, first of all, European funding, which is really important because there's a significant cost to these types of inquiries, and if you can get European funding or any type of funding to do or to help with the inquiry, that's really positive. Since we've moved out of the European Union, we can't ask to be a part of a JIT investigation, but if a European country has got an interest in a crime group who are operating in the UK somewhere, they can ask a UK force to be part of that joint investigation, and they would get some of the funding from that. So definitely we work in my time in the unit, and my knowledge, we've worked with various different policing agencies throughout the UK, Europe, and further afield.
That's very useful. And I'm going to throw the next question out and just see who maybe wants to respond. Are there particular areas of Scotland where human trafficking is particularly prevalent, or is it quite evenly spread across the country? Or perhaps someone could help us to understand the picture a bit more clearly.
I could possibly start in that, yeah. So adult services websites and sexual exploitation. If you go into an adult services website, you'll see individuals selling sex in every major town and city in Scotland, and there's no doubt in my mind that quite a lot of that will be exploitation. So from a sexual exploitation point of view, for me, that's probably happened throughout Scotland. In terms of labour exploitation, you do get some seasonal work. Just now we're coming into the fruit picking agricultural season, so the more rural areas of Scotland, Perthshire, some of the fishing industries as well, the processing plants, food processing plants as well. So it's just different areas have different types of exploitation and trafficking. You've also got criminal exploitation. We find a lot of Vietnamese in cannabis cultivation, and what we call gardeners is the individuals who are actually looking after the cultivation, who are very skilled at it, but the vast majority of those poor individuals have been exploited and are being exploited, and they're put in real significant danger because these cannabis cultivations, they're bypassing electricity. They're not trained, qualified electricians, so what they're actually doing is putting that house at risk of fire, putting the individual or the gardener at risk of death. And quite often it's in blocks of flats and high-rise flats. So you're putting not only them, but a whole lot of other people at risk of danger as well. But it's a bit seasonal, but you've got criminal exploitation, labour exploitation, sexual exploitation, particularly sexual exploitations happen everywhere. Criminal exploitation in terms of county lines, I know you don't like that kind of term, Paul, but child exploitation is happening probably in the east of the country, the north of the country, not so much in Glasgow, because Glasgow crime groups wouldn't tolerate MDLs coming in trying to take over their patch, if you like. And then just the seasonal work in terms of the agricultural work and the labour exploitation that comes with that is more prevalent in the rural areas of Scotland. Thanks, Stephen. And maybe try and squeeze a couple of questions in just before I hand back over. Emily, maybe if I could come to you. The gig economy, Rosalind says, seems to be making it easier for people to be exploited in general. Is this likely to be worse for people who are coming from abroad, people who are being trafficked?
Yeah, again, a really great question, getting into the kind of systemic nature of the problem. Before I answer that though, I just wrote in the chat, and I'm going to click send, so I'm going to say that I'm doing it, on the question of whether people mainly get deported. If you're a non-UK, non-EU victim of modern slavery, who the government, the single competent authority that was referred to, has confirmed as a victim, the majority of you will be removed from the country unless you enter into a lengthy asylum claim. We do not give confirmed victims the right to stay in the UK, and there's a campaign that I've linked to that's trying to get them 12 months minimum to stay in the UK that the government is consistently rebuffing, even though it has a cross-party backing and so on. So it's another bit of political frustration. The gig economy, yeah. So obviously the gig economy is predicated on kind of precarious workers who are treated often falsely as self-employed. And what that means is that they don't have kind of clear pathways to complain about their treatment, to unionize, and therefore protect their rights. It also means that our entire kind of economy and supply chains have sort of fragmented. They're more like supply webs now. So you get, I'm sure that this must be kind of relevant to that really interesting case you talked about earlier, actually, Thornhill, whatever it's called. The like supply chain situation where you have more and more agencies, more and more outsourcing, and that goes down and down into very precarious work, 0 hours work, agency work. What that means is you have, crucially, people who are fairly desperate for income, especially if they've got no recourse to public funds, if they are migrants. Not all victims are migrants, obviously. And so they are going to say yes to whatever someone is offering them, and they've got none of those like protective factors in there. I think it's interesting that we heard earlier about the kind of, from Carmen, about, the economy of care being core to this group's way of thinking about stuff. And I think a real economy of care is about the structures and systems underneath everything. Of course, we need to do the policing and we need to do the things to like identify people now and support people now, of course, but we also need to be looking at those structures and systems. Otherwise, it's all just kind of surface level. And I've been thinking a lot about actual care over the last patch of life. I was caring for my mum for 3 years until autumn last year. And that is obviously, as I'm sure many people on this call know, a very difficult life situation that isn't solved by superficial things, but is a structural problem of lack of support. And I actually think this is a very analogous problem, where it's looking at those deeper structures that are creating those conditions, that endemic precarity, lack of social safety nets, immigration policy, obviously, and these things, and that's the real answer, but it's a harder battle.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you all. I've enjoyed chatting, and I'm sorry to those whose questions we didn't quite get a chance to pick up. Emily, there is one specific question that you might be able to pick up in the chat, perhaps, just before I hand back to Marian.
Thank you very, very much for that, to all of you. Thank you especially to Callum for all your help this evening. The link to the recording for this evening, and I think we probably all need to listen to all of that all over again. It will be available very, very soon. Thank you so much to Emily, to Stevie, to Paul and Carmen, and thank you all for participating, asking such insightful questions. I'm not sure that we leave each other this evening with a greater understanding of many of the aspects of human trafficking, because it's so incredibly complex. But this evening has given us pause to reflect and perhaps to work in our parishes and communities to educate ourselves, our young people, and to take this forward and to make the changes that are necessary. So could I now ask, sorry for running a little bit over time, but I think it was well worth it. Could I thank you all and thank Father John Convery and ask him to bring our evening to a close. Thank you, Father John.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you yourself and Pax Christi for putting on this this conference this evening. Just before we finish, I'd like to say I was struck by a couple of things, especially by the passion of Carmen, that we should go out onto the streets and demonstrate. I'm sure that that's a reminder to all of us of the seriousness of this problem. And also the whole economy of human trafficking. I'm sure if we take on board Stephen's mantra of follow the money, I'm pretty sure if we follow the money, it may end up on our own doorstep and our own demands that we have in the society that we live in, that allows a situation like this to arise. And I think we're all maybe have to reflect upon ourselves, and another way of demonstrating, Carmen, may be that we have to reflect upon our own lifestyles and the demands that we have. But anyway, let's end our meeting this evening just by once again turning to the God of our understanding and our own spirituality to ask God's forgiveness, but also to pray for those victims and collaborators of human trafficking in our communities around the world. O God, our words cannot express what our minds can barely comprehend and our hearts feel when we hear of children and adults deceived and transported to unknown places for purposes of sexual exploitation and forced labor because of human greed. Our hearts are saddened and our spirits angry that their dignity and rights are being transgressed through threats, deception, and force. We cry out against the degrading practice of trafficking and pray for it to end. Strengthen the fragile spirited and brokenhearted. Make real your promise to fill these, our sisters and brothers, with a love that is tender and good, and send the exploiters away empty-handed. Give us the wisdom and courage to stand in solidarity with them, that together we will find ways to freedom that is your gift to all of us. And may Almighty God bless us, keep us and our loved ones, and give us a peaceful and restful night. Amen.
Amen, and thank you very, very much, Father John, and to all of you who've been with us tonight. I see that there are words like challenging in the chat box. I hope that we'll continue to be challenged and to accept that challenge. So good night, everyone, and thank you again.